When I was around 4, we lived in a 5-story building with a basement that could only be accessed by a trap door. My little sister and I weren't allowed to go down there because the steps were unsafe, though the trap door was too heavy for us to open even if we'd wanted to. One day, I was sitting on the stairs about 6 feet from the entrance to the basement when the trap door began to open. At the same time, I found myself suddenly paralyzed. I couldn't move or speak. As I sat there, an elf-like creature climbed out of the basement. The creature was about as tall as I was, dressed in green and brown and wearing a pointed hat. It sat down next to me and spoke in a weird, whistling, clicking language, which I couldn't understand. But somehow I got the impression that its name was Frick Frick. Eventually, the creature returned to the basement, and as soon as the trapdoor was shut, I was able to move and speak again. The same thing happened to me several more times over the next 3 or 4 years, always in the same place, with the same paralysis, and Frick Frick always doing nothing but talking in his strange language, occasionally tapping me on the arm. I wasn't afraid by them because I'd gotten used to it. Then, when I was 8 years old, my family moved to a new house and I never saw Frick Frick again. In the years since then, I've spoken about Frick Frick to both my brother and sister. Neither of them remember being visited by him, but my brother, who is 2 years older than me, remembers seeing me sitting on the stairs by the trap door, just staring into the distance, as though in a trance. I am now in my late 60s. The experience I'll relate took place on the southern Gold Coast, Queensland, in 1984. At the time the event took place, I was divorced and lived in the house with my 2 young children. I'm neither a drinker of alcohol nor a user of drugs. They've never been a part of my life. I had no interest in fairies, goblins, gnomes, elves, or the like, nor had I been reading about them or watching anything about them on TV. If asked if I believed in little people, I would unhesitatingly have replied, no. I attended a seminar in New Zealand along with several dozen other Aussies. After the trip, a colleague of mine drove me home. My children were in the care of a neighbor. It was very rare to have a night to myself. Being well rested and relaxed, I was looking forward to spending a few hours reading or watching TV. First, I made a cup of tea. The television was on. The front main door was open, but the security screen was locked at the catch. As I sipped the tea, I decided I might as well unpack. I carried an armload of clothes to my bedroom and hung them in the wardrobe. At the same time, I noticed the light in the room seemed unusually bright, and something was strange about the atmosphere. I had no time to analyze this before I was overcome with an exhaustion so intense that I only had time to stagger backwards to the bed. I lay face up, but looked down to make sure my shoes weren't making marks on the bedspread, and that was that. I must have lost consciousness. Next thing I knew, I could hear the sound of several voices. They were argumentative voices and seemed to be telling each other to hurry, hurry. I managed to lift my head and look around. And there were several small people trying to pull me from the bed, feet first, and into the wardrobe. The wardrobe was only 1/2 meter approximately from the foot of the bed. I saw that the left-hand side of the wardrobe was open. The wardrobe had 2 sliding doors. I'd hung clothes in the right-hand side, which had required that both wardrobe doors be pushed to the left. and now the little people were trying to pull me into the left-hand side, which would have required someone to push both doors to the right. I should explain here that during the event, I must have been operating similar to a video camera in that I saw and heard only, and what I saw and heard must have been committed to memory. At the time, however, I did not experience normal thought processes. So what I remembered afterwards and now is the product of my mental video camera. At the time, it did not dawn on me that the doors had been moved. I simply saw several small people trying to pull me from the bed and into the half-open wardrobe. I experienced no shock or alarm. Instead, I told myself I had lots of time to continue sleeping because I was far too big and heavy for them to move very far. Now, I'm of the opinion that those thoughts were not my own, but were in some way suggested to me. Whatever the case, I must have lost consciousness again because the next thing I remember is waking up to find several people crowded around me. They didn't speak as far as I know. I was now lying with my head at the foot of the bed, so my feet must have been at the head of the bed. I have a very clear memory of how the people appeared. There were males and females. I can't remember how many, but at least 6, possibly more. One, a male, was larger than the others and appeared to be their leader. He was closest to me. At first, he stared into my eyes with both of his eyes. Then there's a blank and his position had changed and he was looking at me with only one of his eyes. Something happened there, but I can't remember. I suspect he was imparting something to me. The creatures appeared as typical gnomes or peasants from storybooks. Based on the height of the bed, their height was perhaps 2 to 2.5 feet tall. They were overdressed. Their clothing was suited to a much colder climate. I can remember it in considerable detail, possibly because in those days I did a lot of home sewing. They were Caucasian. Their skin looked weathered, as if they worked outdoors a lot. And their skin had a muddy cast. They had strong facial bones, wide cheekbones, wide jaws, strong chins and noses. Their eyes and mouths were long horizontally, but vertically narrow and seemed recessed between the strong facial bones. The best way to describe their faces would be squashed, as if a heavy weight had been placed on top of their heads, squishing them downwards. Their bodies were stout, robust, with deep chests, broad waists, and strong shoulders. I couldn't see the bottom half as well, but the men had no beards or other facial hair, and the women wore scarves wrapped around their chins. I must have lost consciousness again because when I saw them next, I was still in the same position, but they were now in the center of the room, looking at me. I looked back at them, but still felt no fear or alarm. I just looked at them, and they looked at me. I had no thought processes at the time. There seemed to be more of them than before, though, and amongst them were a couple of younger males who seemed a bit nervous or unsure. The other men were impassive. The women, however, seemed to enjoy my predicament. Based on my mental video recording, I later regarded them as overworked, joyless, and not overly intelligent. It seemed I was simply a job to them, and they all seemed a bit nervous. Next, I was aware of the voices again, as before, querulous, talking over the top of each other and urging each other to hurry, hurry. I raised my head and, to my alarm, saw that they'd almost succeeded in pulling my legs from the bed. My body was now right way up on the bed again, with my head at the head of the bed and my feet near the wardrobe. When I saw that they'd almost pulled all of my legs from the bed, a surge of adrenaline shot through me. and I grasped that it wouldn't be much longer before gravity did the rest of the job for them. All they'd have to do would be to steer my falling body into the wardrobe. I yelled out and kicked at them. Then I jumped from the bed and into the center of the room. The room seemed far brighter than usual. I remember standing there and yelling at them. I still wasn't afraid. I was angry with them. They muttered between themselves now. They looked and sounded resigned, bitter. Then they filed into the open half of the wardrobe. They seemed to go in and then down, as if filing down a ramp inside the wardrobe. I stood there watching them, probably for a few seconds. Then, still with the light seeming far brighter than usual, I turned towards the door and left the room. It was only a small house. The hallway was only 3 or 4 meters long. I left the room, went through the hallway towards the living room, and that's when I became completely consumed with terror. Nothing happened between yelling at the creatures and making it towards the living room, but in those few seconds I was overtaken by sheer terror, which seemed to escalate with every instant. I've never known fear like it, yet there was no real reason for it. I suspect now that when the creatures departed, they removed whatever calming influence they'd subjected me to during the ordeal itself. After phoning the colleague who dropped me off earlier that evening, I stumbled out of the house and into the middle of the road. I was desperate to be with someone and was moaning in the hope that someone would come out and rescue me. I was completely without shame and must have been reduced to the level of a small child. But I must stress that I wasn't afraid, consciously at least, that the little creatures would return to attack me. There wasn't a real focus for the terror, it just was. The terror was feeding more terror. Not long afterwards, my colleague returned and drove me to his house. He didn't speak to me. I didn't care. I was just glad to be with someone and to be getting away from my house. When we arrived at his place, I got into bed, but I couldn't get warm. He put a pile of blankets on top of me, but I was still freezing. I realize now that I was in shock. I wouldn't let him leave the room or turn off the lights after that. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. When I awakened, he wasn't there. And the next morning, he wouldn't discuss any of it. I was anxious. He thought I'd gone insane and tried to explain what had happened. He didn't want to talk about it, but he did say he'd never seen anyone so terrified as I'd been when he'd seen me in the road. We never discussed it again, despite that we married the following year. When I asked him how long had elapsed between when he dropped me off and receiving my phone call asking him to come and get me, it seemed the entire experience of the little people had been no more than perhaps 15 minutes. Possibly less. But I'll never forget it. Thanks for watching. Those two stories come courtesy of Malcolm Smith from over at his blog Malcolm's Musings. He posts a lot of weird encounter stories like this, and I encourage you to go and check it out. I altered the first story slightly. I just switched it from third person to first person so it would be more interesting to listen to. But if you want to read the original version of either of these, you should really check out his blog. The link is in the description below. In the meantime, I'd like to welcome all the new subscribers to the channel, and thank you guys so much for all your support. I really feel like we're building a unique and cool community here. So please keep commenting and like and subscribe if you're new, and do send me your experiences and requests. My email is in the description. Until next time, this has been a visit from your Scary Fairy Godmother.